Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Understanding Culture, Climate and Engagement, Choosing the Right Survey for Your Business. My name is Cassie Bolter, and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Centis. Today's presenter is Dr. Amy Hawkes, Centis's Head of Psychology. Amy is an endorsed organisational psychologist with experience in organisational development, leadership, culture and wellbeing. Experienced in both research and consulting, Amy has conducted individual and organisational interventions, large research projects, and has 10 years experience as an academic. Just before we get underway, please note that we're unable to hear you during the presentation, so if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box and Amy will address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us. I'll now pass over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Cassie. It's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone today, and having good quality evidence-based data is something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about these climate, culture and engagement surveys. But first, I thought I'd give you a quick introduction to Centis for those who may not be aware of Centis and the work that we do. We work with clients from a range of backgrounds and industries, including mining, construction, healthcare, education, councils, and help them with everything safety related, from individual attitudes through to culture, leadership, governance. And so our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organizations for the better every day. And we do this by sharing our knowledge through training and coaching and getting people really involved in understanding how to be safe. By the end of the hour, I'll give you an overview of the components of engagement and the differences between engagement, climate, and culture. We'll touch on some recent research across these areas, and you'll have a sense of when and why to use engagement or culture assessments, and some tips for selecting quality assessments at the end. So there are many high quality assessments out there to choose from. Equally, there are some very poor quality assessments. And so I hope that by the end of the session, you'll have a sense of these concepts and can make some informed choices for any survey that you might be considering running in the future. Today, I have a few polls that will pop up on the screen as we go through, and I'd really love it if you could participate, select some answers. A few times I might ask you to pop an answer in the chat. So if you can do that, that would be fantastic. And we'll get through as many of those Q&As that you put in the Q&A box at the end of the session as well. So to begin with, we have a poll, and I'd love to hear how confident you feel explaining the difference between culture, climate, and engagement. So not at all confident, somewhat confident, or very confident. So these three words are often thrown around with little consideration for their actual meaning. And climate and culture particularly are often mixed together to refer to the same thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a little bit of confusion out there, and it's one of the reasons that we're having this chat today. So let's give it 5 more seconds and then we'll have a look at the results. Thanks so much, Cassie. So it looks like we've got about just under half the group not at all confident, and just over half the group somewhat confident, and a couple of people very confident. That's really, really interesting, and sort of what I'd expect to see for this sort of question, and for hopefully at the end of this session, we'll see a nice movement up and a bit more understanding across the group. So one of the reasons for talking about this topic today is there's been a huge amount of attention across these fields. So we see a lot of academic literature over the last 5 years across safety, climate, safety, culture, and work engagement. And we've also seen a really big push from executive teams and boards to gather this data. So heaps of surveys out there being advertised, trying to tell the difference between them is often difficult. And by the end of today's session, you'll have a few tips for being able to compare and select the right assessments. And there's also been some general confusion around when and why to use them. So as an example here, we're having a chat to a client recently who'd been running internal employee engagement surveys every 6 months for about the last 3 years, and had been using that data as a proxy for culture and trying to track culture change and culture interventions. And this led to some really interesting discussions with the client around what they were measuring, why they were measuring it, and it led to the inspiration to run this webinar. And we believe there are probably a lot of organizations running similar style of engagement surveys and interpreting the results in this way. So what we're seeing in this example is a disconnect between the target of the evaluation and the target that the organization is interested in. And the best way I can explain this is to look at the system that we work in. So we don't live in isolation and we don't work in isolation as much as COVID policies over the last 2 years may have wanted us to. And when we want to think about running assessments within a workplace, we need to think about what level we're seeking to gather information on. So engagement and satisfaction, for instance, exist at this individual level. They're specific to the individual and individuals will vary. And I'm going to talk more particularly about engagement and a little about satisfaction later on. Culture and climate are broader. These exist at the organizational level, and you can assess these from the perspective, you can't assess these from the perspective of a single person. And so it's worth noting that there are interactions across these levels. So this is a dynamic process of constant influencing and being influenced across the levels. So for instance, individuals collectively influence and create team level variables such as team cohesion and team productivity. If we have a new team member join us, we'll notice changes in the way the whole team works. And the organization also influences the success of the team through the provision of resources and support. So if we put a safety spin on this, individuals might hold attitudes about safety and behave in safe or unsafe ways. At a team level, we'll have factors like team support for safety, perhaps supervisor safety leadership, and at the organizational level, we'll have policies and procedures, executive level safety commitment, lead and lag indicators and metrics that the organization might be following and tracking. And at the external level, to the organisation, we'll have safety legislation, guidance from industry groups. And so we can see how each of those levels are going to influence the way the organisation works and the way the individual works. Another important factor to consider when deciding to run an assessment is which of these areas you really want to focus on. And so a common way of thinking about workplaces is that we might have a set of inputs, and these could be things like leadership, climate, culture, support, reward and recognition programs, performance management, training, values, all the things that we think about putting into our workplace. And we expect these inputs to have an influence or drive outcomes. And these are the factors that we're trying to achieve. So these are productivity outcomes, satisfaction, reducing turnover, increasing engagement, improving behavior, improving commitment. And so this is how we often see this sort of input to outcome relationship talked about in organizations. And we often see that culture and climate, it obviously sits in that input category, whereas things that are more individually focused, behaviors and attitudes like engagement, are going to sit in that outcome category. In reality, it's often more of a cycle or an interaction between these inputs and outcomes. It's not quite as simple as we might like. And it can feel a little bit like the chicken and the egg. Which comes first, our inputs or our outcomes? Do our productive staff make it easier to be a good leader, or does leadership make people more productive? Do satisfied and engaged team members help build our productive climate, or does climate build engagement and satisfaction? So while we might like to think about these as two separate boxes or perspectives, they're actually very closely intertwined. And so when it comes to surveying our staff, we need to decide, what are we most interested in knowing about, the outcomes or the inputs, or potentially a little bit of both. And outcomes can be really appealing to focus on and track because they can show that thing that we all think we're working towards, that we're all trying to achieve, that we're all trying to change, that we're all trying to influence with our inputs, but they actually don't always give you the information on what you need to change, on where you should be targeting your change and your interventions, which is why a focus on some more of those input features with a little bit of those outcome factors measured as well kind of gives you that nice balance. So I have our next poll up on the screen, and this is, I'm really interested to hear from you guys about if your workplace conducts workforce surveys and if that, how frequently that occurs. So never, occasionally, every 6 months, or annually. And if you can please let me know in the chat if your workplace does conduct regular surveys, what types of surveys your organization has conducted. So just a simple keyword here, so satisfaction or engagement, leadership, culture, empowerment. I'd love to hear what sort of surveys are currently out there being conducted. Fantastic. Thank you. Give it a few more seconds. So it looks like we've got quite a few organizations that are polling and assessing their workforce fairly regularly. So quite a few at that annual level, only sort of around that 10%, 12% at the never. So we are seeing that it's something that a lot of organizations are doing quite regularly. That's fantastic. And the sorts of assessments, if you pop that in the chat and let us know what sort of assessment you're running, we see things coming through like leadership, 360-degree leadership assessments, satisfaction. That's great. Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's delve into a little bit more detail on what those workforce surveys might look like, and a little bit more around culture and climate. So surveys can be really useful for gaining insight and giving our people voice to raise concerns and issues. They can be relatively cheap and quick to roll out. So as we've seen, there are a variety of surveys that can be run, and our focus today on culture, climate, and engagement. So we're going to start with culture. There's been many broad organisational culture approaches out there, and they build off early models of national culture, such as the ones presented by Hofstede, and these models often adopt a continuum of high to low, presence to absence approach to defining culture. So this is where we might see descriptive words such as collaborative or competitive, a high power distance or a low power distance, a strong achievement orientation or a weak achievement orientation. And so there are a variety of culture models that present these typologies of culture, often based on two continuums. So you end up with 4 quadrants of the type of culture. And these can be really useful for understanding differences between workplaces, but they do tend to miss the nuances of real life and the complexity of an organization's culture. Edgar Schein is one of the most well-known scholars to describe and build a model of organizational culture that focuses on the way cultures develop, maintained, and influences behavior. And he talks about these 3 main components. At that deeper underlying level is those basic assumptions, those underlying norms, the way that things get done around here. And those are the things that influence espoused values, what we talk about being important, what we see happening through our policies and procedures come through in our artifacts. So that might be our posters on the walls, the way the workplace is designed, things written down in, as I mentioned, our policies and procedures. So it's a really useful model for looking at the way we might break down culture. But again, organizations and culture is very broad. And so it's really nice to be able to target in on a specific area of culture, such as safety culture. And definition for safety culture here for you is that an organization's shared beliefs and values about safety. So essentially the way things are done around here. And so you can see that underlying norms, attitudes, values, beliefs that might exist in an organization and how that's influencing those espoused values and those artifacts that exist. And this is why, because the keywords here being those belief and values and underlying assumptions, these are things that people may not always talk about. And so it's really important to measure culture using qualitative approaches such as interviews, focus groups, and observations. And it's also really cool to think about the influence of subcultures here. So that's my first tip, to make sure that you can sort your data using some demographic filters such as site or location and look for patterns in the data. I thought I'd quickly share our Centre Safety Culture model so you can get a sense of what an approach to safety culture might look like. And it can be explored from a variety of factors. Person, practices, and environment are all key components of our safety culture model and are supported at the various levels of leadership. So that's why leadership exists around the model, from frontline right through to executive, all have an influence across the person, practices, and environment features of safety culture. So as I just mentioned, safety culture can be assessed using interviews, focus groups, and observations. Once we have that data, we seek to organize it into themes that sit under these broad categories that are coming up on the screen at the moment. And this is really important because it's something that's shared. We're interested in seeing factors that are consistent across the data. And that's the benefit of this qualitative approach. It allows you to get at those underlying assumptions, beliefs, and values about safety that might be unique to your organization. So once we have that data organized into themes, we can map it onto a maturity model. This model draws on a couple of theoretical discussions of cultural maturity, including Hudson's model, and builds out descriptors for each of the factors in the culture model on the previous slide. And it gives the opportunity to understand the way culture is influencing your outcomes and identify areas for improvement and track that progress over time. A quick example here of what cultures at each end of the maturity model might look like. And so we've got at that lower end, we've got more counterproductive culture, that blame, avoidance, being complaining, problem focused. And at the higher end, where we see that mateship and citizenship, we're seeing more responsibility, more in control, accountable, solution focused approaches, which we talk about as sitting in that more internal locus of control space. So there are many other webinars you can listen to on our website if you're interested in learning more about safety culture and the maturity model in a bit more detail. But at the moment, I'm going to move on to talk about climate. So there's often a lot of confusion between culture and climate, a strong emphasis on the academic literature that these are separate constructs. However, they are still related, so often the literature ends up discussing them both together anyway. It's useful to understand the background and the history of where culture and climate have come from. Culture comes from an anthropological tradition of immersing yourself in a world to truly understand how it operates. So you think about a national approach to culture or a tribal approach to culture, where you might have an anthropologist who goes out and places themselves in a community and looking at those values, the way things are communicated, the interactions and the hierarchy. So that's the original kind of place in the academic arena where culture has developed. While climate comes from quite a different perspective. It's from that psychological science tradition, based more in trying to quantify and measure human behavior, measure those attitudes and emotions through individual perceptions, and in a way that can be replicated. So they're very different approaches. There's a variety of ways in that psychological tradition we can define climate. So we could talk about psychosocial safety climate, which is the perceptions of management's care for your psychological well-being, ethical climate, which is that perception of procedures and policies that shape expectations around ethical behavior. We could also talk about quality climate, service climates, innovation climates. But let's talk about safety climate. And it's demonstrated through that individual's shared perceptions and observations of the organization's approach to safety. And we can think about this as a snapshot or surface display of deeper safety culture. So climate is really about what you can feel when you walk into an organization. It's what you see and hear. So it's sort of what's at the top of that iceberg on the screen at the moment. And it can be measured using a survey. It's an individual's perception. And so that's allowing us to standardize our approach with the same questions for everyone, and they can share their perceptions of safety on key dimensions. And then the keyword there being shared, we can look at aggregating that across the team and across the organization. Climate's driven by that deeper safety culture, what sits underneath the surface. So while safety climate might be more visible, this means we can also make surface changes that people can notice quickly. But to embed those changes and to get that deeper cultural change happening, it's going to take time. It's going to need ongoing maintenance to shift those assumptions and beliefs. There's a variety of resources available that discuss the difference between climate and culture. So this is a really useful summary to quickly compare the difference between the two. So we see on the safety culture side, it's that more organizational level issue, whereas in the climate side, it's that aggregated shared individual level. And we can see there's a widely shared awareness of risks and hazards. At culture side, climate, we're looking at that individual awareness of risks and hazards. Culture, again, looking at that management commitment to safety, and climate relying a little bit more on that personal commitment to safety. And as I've been mentioning, they are overlapping constructs. They do influence each other. So the last line there talking about culture being a leading indicator of climate and vice versa, climate being a leading indicator of culture. So some outcomes of a mature safety culture where people are caring about safety, where they're actively contributing to safety, include things like reporting. So often we see an increase in reporting as an organization moves up through that safety culture maturity model, where people feel safer to be reporting and letting hazards and incidents come through the system. We often see an increase in personal satisfaction with their work, an increase in engagement, a reduction in some of our indicators such as LTIs. And we also see that positive safety climate. As I said, climate being that surface snapshot of that deeper culture. And lastly, we're also likely to see a transfer effect where a mature safety culture is related to improvements in overall culture. This is a great point to pause and reflect because we've covered a lot of content. So please take a moment to consider for yourself, what is the safety culture and safety climate like in your organization? How does the culture and the climate influence choices that you and others might make at work? And how do you see this impacting your experiences and your team? Our final topic to talk through today is engagement. So imagine this. What does it feel like to wake up feeling excited about going to work, feeling energized by your work, to achieve a state of flow, to be so deeply absorbed in your work that you don't even realize time is passing? And this is the feeling of engagement. It's the most common and widely accepted model of engagement is from Bakker and Schaffelli, and it talks about three main components. So vigor, having high energy and resilience, dedication, being involved and experiencing significance, enthusiasm and challenge in our work, and absorption. So that sense of kind of losing yourself in your task, being engrossed in what you're doing. As we discussed at the start, engagement is an individual variable. And so it's often measured as an outcome or an endpoint, something we're working on achieving or improving in our organizations. And there's a substantial amount of research on the broader impact of workplace culture, leadership, team climate, all positively influencing engagement. And also the relationship between engagement and other components like productivity and retention. So while we have the definitions up, my next top tip is to look at an engagement survey and ask yourself if these three factors are what the survey items are actually measuring. Unfortunately, we see a lot of engagement surveys that don't actually assess these factors at all. And two factors that are often confused with engagement are satisfaction and burnout. So satisfaction is an individual's general attitude towards his or her job, an emotional state based on considering or appraising your job and your experiences at work. And we can explore general global job satisfaction, so how satisfied are you with your job overall, or we can target specific facets. So this could be like satisfaction with pay, satisfaction with your supervisor, satisfaction with work tasks. The second factor is burnout. So initially thought to be at the opposite end of the continuum to engagement, burnout's characterized most commonly by exhaustion, cynicism, detachment, and a lack of effectiveness or accomplishment in your work. Now we know burnout to be a separate experience at work and that it's actually possible to be both engaged and burnt out at the same time. So there was a really interesting study recently conducted by some Queensland academics that looked at engagement and burnout in a group of teachers. And as you might expect, there were some teachers who were high on engagement and low on burnout, some teachers at the other end who were high on burnout and low on engagement. And there was also another group who were high on both, high on engagement and high on burnout, indicating that while we may feel dedicated and absorbed into our work, we can also feel exhausted sometimes. So this is a model that I'd like to quickly share with you. It's a job demands resources model, and it's a great model for understanding the factors that drive engagement and burnout. So if we look first at engagement, this theory describes the job resources that may be present to help build engagement, and I'm going to talk more about those on the next slide. The model also explores burnout and the job demands that can be placed on individuals that lead to burnout. So these demands could be task-based demands such as work pressure or lack of role clarity. They could also be emotional demands or physical demands would fit here as well. And this model recognizes that while we might have high levels of job demands that could lead to us feeling burnt out, we also have resources that help us manage those demands and buffer us against burnout. At the same time that job resources might help us feel engaged and involved in our work, they can also be hindered by the presence of these job demands. So this model helps us understand why one person in the same environment might feel burnt out while the other doing the same job doesn't. And it's got to do with the resources that they have available to them to manage those demands. And so we can look at a supportive climate as a resource that allows people to deal with demands and maintain their engagement. So for instance, the psychosocial safety climate's received a lot of attention in the literature as an upstream organizational resource, promoting engagement and buffering from burnout. So these are the resources that build engagement, including features like leadership, co-worker support, supervisor support, receiving regular and useful feedback on your work, having a sense of autonomy or control about our work. Here we see a couple of meta-analyses that have supported the role of culture and climate in leading to engagement, and also a sense of appreciation, recognition for your work that you've been doing. So these features here are the resources that we're seeking to understand, to build and ensure we have in our workplace so that we see engagement as an outcome. As we spoke about in the previous slide with the job demands resources model, we need to make sure that we're not just building these features, but also considering those demands and the features of the workplace that might be hindering our ability to build engagement. So it's about balancing a focus on both resources and demands. There's another really interesting piece of research that's identifying the dark side of engagement. So these are people who we might perceive originally as a workaholic, and they're people who are not switching off, which raises a really interesting question about how much engagement should we be aiming for. All right, I've got the next poll up for you at the moment, and I'd love to hear about your experience when you've run a workplace survey. So how much change has been achieved following a workplace survey that you've seen? None, some small changes, moderate changes, or heaps, it made everything better. So we've covered a lot of information in this session quite quickly around culture, climate, the difference between the two, and engagement. And so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the sorts of surveys, the way we can achieve change from those surveys. Are they gathering dust on the shelf, or have they helped to make a real impact? Fantastic. That looks great. Thank you, Cassie. So we've got some people in the group who have shared that they've seen no change at all, so about 10% with no change at all. We've got some small changes from the majority of people, and some people have seen more moderate changes. Fantastic. So this is a really common issue, that the survey is often selected because it's seen to help push along a change. But really achieving that change is much more complex, and it's something that a survey alone is not going to be able to do, and that's why we often see these sorts of responses where there wasn't any change, nobody heard anything about the survey. The stages of change model up on the screen at the moment can be a really useful way for understanding how to support a survey to achieve that change. And this model can be applied to anything you're trying to change in your personal life or in your organization. So here we can see the stages that we work through, from that pre-contemplation where we haven't even thought about whether or not we need to change this, through to contemplation, starting to think about it, starting to go, oh, maybe that would be a good thing to do. Preparation, getting ready for that change, taking the action to achieve the change, and then maintaining that as an ongoing shift in the way we do things. So you can imagine that a set of survey results are really unlikely to help people move all the way through this model. But one way to support your survey results to achieve change is to share them widely. Seek feedback and involvement in the results, gather key stakeholders to help them plan, prepare, and implement the action stages here. And through sharing that, we start to get people into that contemplation stage, into that preparation stage. And by taking them on that journey, we're more likely to see some ongoing, lasting changes. In the next slide, I have an example of a model that's worked really well with a number of our clients on how to get the most from your diagnostic results. So at the end of the day, what matters is what you do with the information. So a survey is only good as what comes next. And we've had a lot of success taking people through this process where we start with the presentation of the results from a variety of diagnostics that would suit that group, workshopping and developing a strategic plan on a page, and having that ongoing monthly group of stakeholders within the organisation who are supported to action the changes and maintain the changes. A mini pulse sort of survey or assessment can be really useful to look at how those changes are being implemented. Are they achieving what you'd hope? But then coming back to that group again, assessing that and repeating your process. Cool. So I hope that made sense. Here we have a few top tips on what to look for when selecting a survey and for successfully running a survey. So first off, communication and implementation needs to be supported. We need clear communication out to the people about the how, why, and when. It's really important that people know what will be done with their answers. It's something that's often overlooked, and people receive a survey and think, where did this come from? Why is this here? Who's going to look at my answers and what's going to be the consequence of them? We need a survey with evidence-based scales that are reviewed regularly for reliability and validity. So ask, what is the evidence behind this measure? Make sure you ask yourself if this measure is assessing what I expect it to measure. And this is where we'll see measures that might just be rebadged versions of alternative measures, of satisfaction measures, or something different. We want to make sure when we run a survey that we allow for some contextualization without losing or changing the meaning of the items. So for instance, if your people are used to the term tailboard instead of pre-start, do you have the option to change that? This is important because it makes it easier for your people to understand the item and you'll get better data. The next tip there is privacy and protection of individual responses. So as I just mentioned, people are often a bit cautious about who's going to see my response and what's going to happen when I give this feedback. And this, having that level of privacy and protection of individual responses will give you the best chance of getting honest feedback. And so this means not providing individual raw data that can be identified by somebody's demographic details. It's really useful with your results to be able to sort through the presentation of the results and filter, as I mentioned earlier, about those key demographics around teams or sites or locations, so you can look for trends and differences. You're not able to filter down to that individual level where you could identify someone, but you are able to look across a broader group of people. And lastly, having actionable recommendations. Be really cautious of surveys that pump the results back at you without consideration or review of what that means for your context or providing specific suggestions. So they're just my top tips to keep in mind when selecting a new diagnostic. And key take-home messages from today include a focus on engagement, culture, and climate being different but related constructs. They're all important for an organization's functioning, and make sure you're measuring what you expect. So culture and climate really get to the why of engagement. We know that those are the features of our organization that are likely to lead to more of those outcomes that we're seeking, such as safe behavior, satisfaction, and engagement. Take care when selecting a survey or running a survey yourself. So make sure you're using evidence-based surveys that are checked regularly for reliability and validity, that they're assessing the things that you're seeking to understand, that they're going to give you the insights you need to target areas for action. Provide good communication to support that survey so your people are ready for it, they know how and why it's going to be used, and have that plan ready for actioning and following up and maintaining that over time. So you're coming back to those results, you're coming back to the plan, you're checking in, you're assessing progress over time as well. And lastly, an extra one to throw in there is make sure you bring your people on that journey, because if we bring our people with us there, then we make sure that the next time we need to run a survey, they're aware of, okay, I saw some changes. As we saw from our responses earlier, there are some people who've seen some moderate changes from surveys, and that's fantastic. But if we're not talking to our people about why we're doing things and how we use their survey results, the next time a survey is going to come up, people aren't going to be as interested or engaged. Fantastic. I spoke earlier about the centre's safety culture model and the need to assess culture qualitatively using observations, focus groups, interviews. So we offer a site safety evaluation that does exactly that. And for climate, we have a safety climate survey that picks up on key climate dimensions at the org and team level, and also identifies some of those outcomes that we might be interested in, like safety behaviour, reporting, of incidents and things like that. So we get a little bit of those outcomes in there as well, so we have that nice blend. So we're really proud of the work that's gone into creating the tools. We're really proud of the literature and evidence base that sits behind them. And so if you'd like to know more about these or any of the other diagnostic tools we offer, please throw your details up into this poll that's come up on the screen, and we'll have somebody from our team get in touch with you. If you do have any questions from today's session, I'd really love it if you could put them in the Q&A box. I'd love to have a chance to answer those questions. Thanks to those who've already submitted some questions through our registration portal, and I'm going to do my best to answer as many as possible in the time that we have left. Thank you. Let's have a look here.
Okay, while we're just letting people put a few last votes in, if you would like that, I might get on to the questions, Amy, because we've had a few come in. So thank you so much. Question number one is, at what frequency are surveys liable to introduce distorted responses due to survey fatigue?
Fantastic. Really good question. So provided you aren't forcing people to complete the survey, you're more likely to see people quit out of a survey than when they get fatigued than offer a distorted response. So there are also strategies you can use when cleaning and checking the data to look for the sort of apathy or distorted survey responses as well. But in general, you'll see there's just a lack of completion in that sort of situation rather than distorted responses. Cool. Oh, yep, sure.
Okay, next question is, focus in a review of our Voice of People program to simplify our tools into a single system. Realising this will mean dropping some best-in-class large culture surveys, for example, human synergistic, but trade-off will be agile to pulse, ability to be more bespoke. Is this the right direction for a modern workplace?
Cool. Yeah, really interesting question. Pulses are definitely very useful, and being able to customize, as I mentioned before, is also really great. I'm not quite clear from that question whether or not, I'm guessing that means running an internally administered survey rather than an externally administered survey. So if that's the case, then you need to be really cautious of the impact that when your staff are responding, they know that somebody internal to the organization has access to that raw data and how the impact that might have on your responses. You'd also be trading off the ability to benchmark against others outside of your organization and potentially some of that support with the interpretation as well. So it's really going to depend on the quality of the survey items that you're using, where they're from. We tend to find that internally developed surveys can often have a bit of bias to them as people have their preferences for what they think is more important rather than something that's been developed and validated based on the literature and across many different organizations. Fantastic.
Thank you. Next question is, how many questions and what rating is best for the safety survey?
So how many questions for a safety survey? I suppose the best way to answer that is what are you trying to do with the results, and how much do you want to know about? So are you looking for just a general quick fast assessment overall, what's our total, or are you trying to assess the depth and the complexity of the various elements as you saw in our our culture model there, we have those people, the practices, the environment, and the leadership, and each of those had different components as well. And so when we apply that model and translate it to what climate might look like, that's where we start to get a whole range of different things we'd like to assess within that safety climate space. So you want to really, and then you've also got your outcomes, safety behavior, your reporting behavior, that sense of production pressure to get the job done at the expense of safety. And we want to make sure that you're trying to get enough detail that you can make some useful interpretations and get actionable ideas. So there's probably not a correct number of questions. It's probably about the quality of the questions that you're asking and also how you're going to use them.
Next question is there a difference between question for operations and office corporate staff?
Yeah, really good question. And something that we often get asked a lot. So in our surveys, we don't differentiate across our main climate dimensions for office staff compared to operational staff. And when we're assessing culture, again, we don't differentiate when we're running our focus groups and interviews with the same base questions, but we're guided by the responses that come back, and we sort of ask the follow-up questions in the direction that the focus group is going on. So when we are assessing in that way, we often get asked this question: shouldn't office and corporate staff be assessed differently? But that's only if you're interested in that individual level variable. And what we're interested in is that organizational level variable where everybody's aware of what's happening around them, what they see across the hallway, what they hear about happening. Even if they're in the office, they might hear about what's happening on site. And so what we are interested in is, do they feel like safety is prioritized? Do they feel that people are held accountable? Do they feel that they can raise concerns or suggestions or ideas? And so even if they themselves haven't had to do some of those things, they're aware of the environment that they're in, and they can still rate the environment that they're in, that they have the resources that they need to be able to do their job safely, and the people around them and the people that they're talking to also have the resources and the environment that they need. And so this is where we're looking at those shared perceptions of safety climate. And this is where we're focusing on that different level, which is why people often expect to be just talking about themselves, because we're so used to doing with engagement and satisfaction and well-being surveys. But when we start to switch over to things like well-being climate, that's where we want to look at that assessment across the organization. What do you see happening around you, as well as what happens specific to you? We do have one specific module, which is on high risk work and the climate that supports high risk work, where we do allow people to select into that module if they are completing high risk tasks. So that's our critical risk module. And that's probably the only one that is tailored and targeted in that way.
Next question is, what recommendations do you have on how a business increases engagement for surveys?
Yep, so as I mentioned earlier, it's really that prep, so that early communication and that follow through. So that sense of people hearing about the results, seeing some changes that's occurred in the organization, or some kind of feedback on what the leadership think about these results, what they'd like to do with the results. So that encourages that engagement in future surveys. And so you want to do the work up front to communicate that, and do that work at the end to follow up with the feedback and build trust.
And you've sort of touched on this, but how do you interpret the percentage of non-completion?
Yep, so what we do is we take the total number of completed surveys that remain after we've done our data cleaning step, and we divide that by the total number of employees that the survey was rolled out to. So for our safety climate surveys, we try to ensure that we get responses from at least 60% of the workforce, because that's really important for having that shared perception across at least the majority of the workplace.
When to have surveys completed confidentially by employees versus being able to explore further results?
Okay, really good question. So this is something that comes up a lot. You know, there might be somebody who submits a survey with really poor ratings, and an immediate reaction is, I want to get in and talk to that person. I want to understand what's going on. But actually, confidentiality increases that honesty. So I'd really recommend spending the time to think about why are you surveying, how do you want to use that information? So getting that aggregate result for something like climate makes a lot of sense. For something like engagement, where you might have one or two people that are particularly disengaged and the preference really is to go and find them and talk to them and find out what you could do, that's something that maybe you need to seek and achieve in a different way to a survey. So initial thoughts could be something like a box at the end of the survey that gave people the opportunity to get some information on who to contact if they'd like to debrief or discuss their results, or they'd like to seek additional support perhaps. And so there's that invitation to contact somebody who'll be able to have that conversation. Again, it's going to depend on your workplace, what you're trying to survey, what you're trying to achieve, and whether or not it might be something that could be done through supervisors, regular kind of conversations with their workplace, kind of having that, getting them trained up to feel out how their staff are going, have those conversations and support them in that moment, rather than perhaps a survey to target people specifically.
Great. Next one is, what is the influence relationship between culture and climate?
Really good question, Troy. The academic literature is quite complicated in that respect, because we will see plenty of climate papers that will, plenty of culture papers that will actually assess climate and vice versa. And what we tend to look for, that influence relationship, I like to think of it as that deeper level norms, assumptions, those underlying beliefs and values that exist in an organization, which are harder to get at with a survey. And so that's why we see that deeper culture is likely to have that influence on the way things are done around here, that sort of snapshot of that climate that might exist in an organization. And so that influence relationship there is probably a little too directional. As we were talking about in our systems model there, that climate is something that probably changes a little bit easier. It's something where we might have an incident in the workplace, or we'll hear a story, and that can shift our perceptions. And so those more instant, quick things, sometimes we'll see them actually over time shift our deeper culture as well. So it sort of goes both ways. It's a hard thing to explain, but I hope that sort of helps answer your question. If I haven't, please throw an extra comment in the box, and I'm happy to have another go at that for you, Troy. Cool.
All right. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We've got two ready, and that might lead us to the end. So second last question is, does climate also include political, budget, positions, pressures, and impact the business is undertaking?
So again, it depends how you've defined climate. So if you're looking, let's say, at ethical climate, or if you're looking at a competitive climate, let's say. So if are you in a collaborative or a competitive climate, then those budget pressures might increase competition. And so it depends what you're focusing on. In the space of that safety climate, absolutely they're going to influence safety climate in your organization, because they're going to become part of the story and the pressures that might be placed on people to get work done faster. But they're unlikely to be part of the climate. They are rather going to be those external forces that are going to influence your climate. Cool, thanks.
Okay, and last one, by research, how long does it take an organisation to reach the highest level of safety culture, and what are your tips?
Okay, so then thinking about our safety culture maturity model there, and how quickly could an organisation achieve safety citizenship? It's a really interesting question, and it probably depends where you start. So are you starting at the counterproductive end, or are you starting at the private compliance end? If you're at that counterproductive end, how long have you been there? Because if those norms and those assumptions are deeply held and something that's quite strong within your organization, it's going to take a lot more time and a lot more effort to slowly work your way through that maturity model. And that's why when we're working with clients, what we're interested in talking to them about is not trying to jump immediately to the end, but to take the next step on that journey, to seek out those changes we can make to slowly achieve each of those steps through public compliance, private compliance, mateship, and citizenship. If, however, you started at private compliance, then you might already have people that are internally motivated to be safe. They have a sense of it being important. And if you started to talk more around that team-based safety at that mateship level, you might find that those sorts of messages are not going to have to work as hard to achieve traction and achieve change. And so it's really going to depend where you start as to how long it takes to get through that model. But main tip, slowly work your way through, slowly take it step by step. And that's where the opportunity to run those site safety evaluations, to get that information. Where's your next target going to be? What are you next going to focus on? Give it 12 to 18 months and then come back and rerun that assessment and look at how things are going then. Cool.
Great. Thank you everyone for all your questions today. I would just like to thank Amy for presenting, and also on behalf of Centis, thank you all for joining us. Our next webinar will be titled How to Become a Safety Culture Change Agent, and that'll be delivered on Thursday, the 9th of June. So we hope you can join us for that. And until then, stay safe.
Thank you all so much.